what did every one of them do? They started hiring, finding, farming, and getting black ball players. A free market solution, once one person broke it. Another way you can look at it, you ever notice when one airline lowers its price on a thing to Miami or wherever, what does every other one do? You follow suit. Because I may think, hey, I'm smart. I'm going to keep my Coke price at $100 and I'll make an extra $10 profit. What are you going to do, my competitor?
Lower the price.
Why?
You want the business.
Market share. You're thinking, okay, I'm willing to still make, let's say, $7 per coat, but now I'm going to sell 10,000 coats instead of 7,000 coats. So I'll make more money. So you're going to force me to be honest. That is the beauty of the free market. That is what Adam Smith was talking about when he spoke of the invisible hand. Just so you know, Adam Smith was very skeptical about capitalists, but not about capitalism, meaning the individual he wasn't trusting. But when everybody has to deal with each other, you all keep each other honest. Because you can't. It's only when the government intervenes. Now, railroads went across this country. They all were done by government money. So the government would subsidize every one of them lost money. But there was one. Union Pacific, I believe it was. Private money. He refused to take any government money. That was the only one that always made a profit. Because he wasn't contingent. It's kind of like what happened now with GM, Chrysler, and Ford. I went out and bought Ford stock as soon as they said they were turning down the money. I said, okay, here's a company finally that's got a little brains that knows they're not going to be beholden to the government. And Ford is the one of the three right now doing the best. Because they're not being constrained by a bunch of bureaucrats. At least as much as possible, not being constrained. Okay, so...
They also capped the capital market before the capital market was tapped, so they got better rates.
Right. Well, the guy who ran it, I remember looking and seeing the three executives who were in charge. Said the only one I knew who had anything on the ball was the guy who went in charge of Ford. That guy, he knew what he was doing. The guy who was in charge of GM for years was brain dead. I used to laugh hysterically, can't believe it. I couldn't believe anybody would be dumb enough to have this guy in power. But they all went for it again, because it was almost like a bureaucratic thing where the chairman of the board, they're all patting each other on the back. Nobody's paying attention to the fact that their numbers don't make any sense. Incidentally, that brings me to something. GM, let's use GM. GM, we bailed them out, right? By the way, thank you very much for bailing them out. Did GM make a profit those years? General Motors, the years where they lost all that money, did they make a profit for the year?
They did in Europe.
They did in Europe. Worldwide, they always made a profit every year. They never had a losing year. But because of the U.S. tax code, because for them to bring the money back to the United States of America, they have to pay 35%. I'm going to ask you, you guys made $100 million overseas. Will you bring it back here and pay $35 million of it? No. No. You're going to do what makes sense. That's the thing. Human nature being what it is, what Adam Smith was talking about. You make a bad structure, I'm going to punish you for bringing it back by telling you got to pay $35 million. They didn't do it. Remember when Hillary Clinton was running for president and she was in Pennsylvania and made this big speech at a factory about losing American jobs and how horrible it is? Yes, it is horrible. It's because of your stupidity with your tax code that you're losing them. But she said, if some companies want to leave this country, she was going to add a tax. She was going to tax them even more. I thought, that's a bright move for the smartest woman in America. So you're going to take more from them. It's going to be like, how much quicker can I get out of the country? Right. Real good move. But meanwhile, I'm thinking, I seem to recall her husband owned a little business with Ron Burkle. And where was it headquartered? Offshore. Because he didn't want to pay the U.S. tax. Right. That's the dirty little secret everybody forgets about Bill Clinton. Or George Soros, who's headquartered down in the Cayman Islands. So he wouldn't have to pay tax. Bottom line, under the FairTax, you're doing away with all that corporate tax nonsense. Because again, corporations don't pay taxes. We're all mad at GE right now for gaming the system. Especially when they're the ones walking around talking about everybody as good, what we call liberals, should be paying more, except them. See, that's the problem I have. They're always telling everybody else what they should do. Well, first, practice what you preach. But, back to my corporate story. So corporations do not really pay tax, right? Who does?
We do.
You do. They just add it to the cost of whatever product you buy. Ultimately, every tax in the world is paid by a living, breathing human being. It comes out of your pocket. what Sue was talking about before, to me, it's real simple about how it affects you at the state level, local level. Every politician at each level, what do they do? Well, if the state wants, I'm in the city now. If the state wants to do that, let's say the state should pay, and everybody claps. State politician, you know what? The federal government wants that, make the federal government pay. Everybody claps. I don't think these folks are thinking this through. No matter whether they call it the state, the federal, the town, it still comes out of your pocket. It's a setup. They're setting you up. And that's why I gotta say, wait, you're not grasping this. I don't want you taking the money, period. I don't need this program. You know, when I ran, I talked about the Board of Education. I would have done away with the Department of Education in Washington and with Trenton. And some people were horrified. How can, I say, let me ask you something. Who is more concerned about the education of your children? You or some bureaucrat sitting on a 15th floor on K Street in Washington? I mean, I think that's a pretty basic thing. I think the local teachers, the local parents, the local school board, they have a little bit more interest in it, instead of all some politically correct nonsense. Sir?
Yeah, I was reading something on Ayn Rand, and I think she had a firm belief in laissez-faire capitalism. And I'm not sure, I mean, I stand to be corrected, but I think laissez-faire means that corporations should be allowed to go...
Laissez-faire basically means let it be.
Right, so there's zero interference from government.
Yeah, she was an extreme.
Now, my question would be this. If a company, an industry,
right,
that's settled,
right,
town developed around it, schools,
yes,
the factory, they decide to uplift and move, go overseas, down the Mexico, whatever.
A company, you say?
An industry.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
I'm sorry, right,
Sure.
a factory.
Okay.
Now, that's going to destroy the entire community.
That's right.
Do the people have a right to say, look, we want to enact a law, or we want something legislated that if that company up and leaves and destroys this community, we have a right to impose a tariff. They can't expect to just make something cheaply outside and sell it back to us.
It doesn't work.
Well, it worked for the union.
It sounds good in theory.
But it worked for the union.
No, it didn't. You know who's one of the biggest proponents of the FairTax? Are unions, because they say, oh my God.
No, I'm not talking about that union. I'm talking about the war of northern aggression.
It doesn't work. Smoot Harley was what started your depression back there. When you talk about the forgotten man, remind yourself, read that part of it. What happened was Hoover, as president, turned around and said, okay, we're going to retaliate. Actually, they weren't even trying to retaliate because nobody put tariffs on us yet. He said, we're going to put a tariff on all foreign goods come in and try to keep American jobs going.
Isn't that what built the country, though? The tariffs was the tax.
That was
before
the only
income tax.
But you got to remember, back then, transportation being international trade was so small. Once it got to where it was big, suddenly, now you have a problem. And that's the problem Hoover. Hoover fell for the Kool-Aid. What he did was he said, okay, I'm going to put a 10% charge on every other country. Now, these people aren't stupid. So what did they do?
10% charge?
Remember, we were the biggest manufacturing country in the world at the time. They taxed our goods.
Well, how do you keep steel here? How do you keep our industry?
Change the tax code. If you change the tax code, suddenly, steel says, gee, it doesn't make sense for me to open up a plant in Brazil. Do it here. If I'm going to produce here, it makes sense. But right now, we pay the 35% tax rate, the highest, second highest in the industrial world. Number one is Japan.
And they're coming down.
Now, give you an idea, we always make fun of the French, right? They're fun to make fun of. But here's the funny thing about the French. Let's take Renault, the car company.
You take it.
They sell a car in the United States. Remember I said before about value-added tax? They tax that car to the gills. But if they sell it here, they get a rebate for all their taxes there to encourage exports. GM tries to sell a Chevy Colt in France. France will tax them there. Then when the money, as I said, if it came back to the United States, they got to pay 35%. So what incentive does GM have to try to bring the money back here or really push the seller part? GM right now is doing great guns in China, but it's GM China. That money is never meant to see the light of day in the United States. Now, so think about it. Renault, a French company, wants to repatriate the money back to their country. United States, we're sitting there dumbly going, no. And you wonder why we have a $50 billion a month trade imbalance? And we're told it's okay to have a trade imbalance. Pure economics, to a certain extent, it's not the end of the world. but not 40 straight years of it. 40 years of every month having a $40 to $50 billion trade imbalance. That means $50 billion comes out of the U.S. collective pocket, goes abroad, never to come back. Illegal immigrants, do they affect our trade imbalance?
Yeah.
Sure, how?
Send money back.
They send money back. Now, again, they take money, they work here, they earn money, they send it back to Mexico or where have you. I don't care where it is. The folks who are getting the money back in the home country, they don't buy any U.S. goods. They're not buying T-shirts made in the good old U.S. of A, are they? Or whatever.
You can't find them.
Right, exactly. Because of our tax code. Halliburton, everybody's favorite whipping boy of 4 years ago. Remember when they moved out of the U.S.? Anybody remember why they moved out of the U.S.? They don't do any business here. All their business right now is in the Middle East. They said, every time we bring the money back here, we're paying 35%. This is stupid. So they now are in United Arab Immigrants or Dubai or what? Dubai. I think they went to Dubai. That's the real world. But will a politician explain that to you? No, because then you'd realize what happened and you would not be happy. In this country, if we change our tax code, we'll start bringing industry back. When Alan Greenspan was the Federal Reserve Chairman, he was asked, and it wasn't even necessarily the FairTax, they said, if you did away though with corporate taxes, incidentally, there's over $11 trillion U.S. corporations are holding offshore. Will not bring back in this country because they're not going to pay the 35% rate. So they asked him, if you do away with the corporate tax and bring it back here, how much of that money would come back here? He said 90% of it. So the question then was, well, how many years would it take? He said, we're not talking years, we're talking a matter of months. And it's true. Why would you leave your money offshore if you could bring it back here? Because we are still the safest country in the world to hold our assets. But we're not going to do it if we think that the pain is too great. Just to give an example, I have a bunch of things here.
What was that figure? How many trillions of dollars?
11 trillion dollars. I have one of them here. Oh. U.S. seeks tax evaders. The Obama administration is now going after these foreign countries where they're holding money to see if they did it illegally. But the best part is, I have another one up here where a month ago, they asked the Obama administration for a tax holiday, the corporations. Now, not for nothing, but I believe there shouldn't be a corporate tax. But why should they be entitled to a special exemption? You ever hear when you hear about these tax holidays, like from New York every once in a while runs a tax holiday, and they bring in a ton of money? Don't you think that would wake these guys up? Now, I will tell you, I have spent a lot of time in Washington, a lot of time in Trenton. God's honest truth. Some of them do get it, and they don't want to give up control. Other ones, it's frightening the quality of some of the people down there. It really is. You leave there and you're just thinking, I can't believe this guy's representing us. It's frightening.
I think they all understand, but they're...
No, they don't. That's my point. It's scary. You think they do, and they don't, and some do. But some of these people you meet, and you go, my God. Oh, my God. How did that happen? It's frightening. Now, one other very important point I want to bring up about the FairTax, and we'll do some more examples and questions, what have you. Remember before what I said about, for instance, a family that makes $40,000 a year, let's say they spend $200 a week on food, that takes a good portion of their chunk, right? So everybody says that would be unfair. That's why the FairTax is regressive, it's not fair. And if that's the way the FairTax worked, they'd be exactly right. But to get around that, when they came up with the FairTax, what they said was, how can we make it so it's a truly level playing field, nobody benefits over anybody else? They came up, excuse me, what they call the prebate. The prebate is where the U.S. government statistics, we're going to use a family of four to keep it simple. Back in 2007, they said a family of four, to meet the basic subsistence levels for their family, would spend $26,000 a year. Okay. Now, the tax...
That's just to sustain fair essentials.
Basic essentials, absolutely right. $26,000. So, the idea is, okay, what would be the tax on those, to meet that $26,000? It comes to $6,000 a year. The FairTax has what we call a prebate. Meaning, at the beginning of every month, $6,000 divided by 12 comes to $500 a month. Every month, at the beginning of the month, you will receive a check for $500 to cover your tax on all those basic necessities. It doesn't matter if you're Bill Gates' family of 4, or your family of 4, or a family on welfare's family of 4. Everybody would get that check for $500, so nobody could claim that they're being unfairly treated or it's not fair to the poor. Make sense? Now, I'm using 4 as an example. If you have 10 kids, you get, for each, each person, there's a level at. I'm just using that for simplicity.
Why are you giving it to the richer people?
Because you want it to be equal, because once you say, well, we shouldn't give it to them, you've let the politicians start being able to say, well, maybe this would be more fair if we did this, this, and this. We're trying to make it where it's foolproof, where the point is that they can't get in there and start making their special favors for anyone.
The family with 10 children get more than the family with
4, right. Now, if you're an individual living by yourself, there's an exemption for you that would probably be about, let's say, $2,400 for the year. So every month, at the beginning of the month, you get a check for $200.
Is there a limit on how many children you can have?
Unlimited.
Or just keep going up?
Unlimited. Somebody actually brought it up to me last week and said, well, in theory then, somebody could just keep having more kids to get the rebate. I said, if they're doing it for that, God bless them.
Ceiling on that.
You can't. You really can't. You really can't.
Yes. I think there's another reason why you cannot have an income ceiling or a children's ceiling or anything like that. To do any such thing, that would constitute a bill of attainder. The Constitution says no bill of attainder or ex post facto law shall be passed. To do that, that means you're legislating that that person, because he makes what you think is too much money, or because he's having what you think are too many children, are somehow guilty of some kind of crime against the state. And we don't do things, or we shouldn't do things, not under the Constitution.
And if you think about it, because a lot of people, and this is what makes it truly progressive. Now, everybody's basic subsistence has been set, right? Everybody starts out on ground zero. But now, I think it's safe to say that Donald Trump is going to spend more money than we are, right? This year, so he'll pay a lot more taxes than we will, which makes it perfectly fair in a sense. And there's no write-offs, no nonsense. Remember what I told you before about what I do for a living? I'm a real estate guy. I get a lot of write-offs. I shouldn't get those write-offs. It's not fair. It's not fair to you. But the way the code is written, they give them to me, and it shouldn't be.
But doesn't that free you up to make further investments?
It does, and you use system to do it. But the bottom line is, why should I be favored over somebody who doesn't own real estate? Put us on equal footing. I tell people all the time, I'll give up every write-off in 10 seconds. I will pay more in tax if you give me the fair tax. But it's the right thing to do. It's what's right for the country. It's not what it's about me. It's about what's right for everyone. But is there something
about real estate investing that maybe is more valuable and important to the spurring of the economy?
No, they had a strong lobby over the years, and they started the thing with the realtors about real estate home ownership and, mom, apple pie, Chevrolet, whatever, all that propaganda. No. Again, a house, when I buy an investment, it should be able to make a profit. If everybody kind of ran it thinking about the property should be making a profit, you wouldn't be hearing stories about unaffordable housing, because everything would have had to stay in a true economic thing. What happened? Does everybody remember the real estate crash in 87, 88? Remember what prompted that? Tax Reform Act of 1986. What they did was, they turned around and said, okay, before that, people had unlimited write-offs. So rich folks, doctors, lawyers, were buying a big office building. They put $100,000 down, pay $1 million, have a $900,000 mortgage. But every year, that property would, let's say, between depreciation and everything else, come up with, say, $200,000 a year in losses. That was directly applied to their tax income. So if I had a $100,000 income and I had $70,000 in tax write-offs, now my taxable income only went down to $30,000. Even though most of it's on paper and things like that. Tax Reform Act said they're phasing out all those things. I can only take a $25,000 per year loss. Everything over that, I truly have to eat. Suddenly, I'm really losing money. So these were all commercial loans. Commercial loans don't have personal liability. They were all owned corporately. So what did the doctors and lawyers do? Here, Mr. Banker, you can't make it work. They took it back. They killed. If you ever want to hear somebody really go off on it, and he's absolutely right, Donald Trump, talking about how Tax Reform Act, and it did. government intervention. They let real estate overheat. I also teach real estate finance and investment classes. I was explaining to people around 2005, your bubble's about to burst. A lot of people didn't want to hear it, but it was a fact. I wasn't a genius, I wasn't a soothsayer, but I do understand finance, I do understand economics. The basics are this. How can real wages be going up 1% a year and house prices be going up 20% a year? They can't. So then they had to keep coming out with all these cute little mortgage programs of minimum payment or negative amp, what have you. Well, sooner or later, you've got to pay for that. The only question was when the resets hit, and what the model they used in the business was, for the crash was, well, historically, the foreclosure rate of default is only 1.2%. And that's what they were actually bamboozling people with their models, whether it was Moody's, Wall Street selling those silly securities or everything else. By the way, they're still doing it. The real estate crash has not fully hit yet, just so you know. It hasn't fully hit. It's going to be very shortly again. And then they're all going to be surprised. So, here's the thing.
Is it corporate parks are entering into that?
Who?
Is it the corporate?
They're trying to cover. They are desperate to kick the can down the road.
Right.
That's why interest rates are very low right now. They should be a lot higher. Pretty soon, China's going to say, you better get them up because we want a better yield. Otherwise, we're pulling everything.
What
That's
if
what
you snuck something in before?
Yes.
You said the fair tax would only tax new stuff. So
Yes.
you buy a house, a brand new house, you pay tax
Yes.
on. But a used house, you don't pay tax
Because
on.
taxes were already paid on that product before. So you won't have. I'm talking about.
You're gonna the used house market is gonna like go crazy.
It'll strengthen it, yes, absolutely. And you know what? You know who's one of the biggest proponents of the fair tax? Because I know where you're going. Home builders, believe it or not. Because they've done the math and said, wait a minute, if all those embedded taxes come out, when I build a new house, I can build it much more affordable. So they're not against it, believe it. As a matter of fact, one of the guys who started the fair tax is one of the biggest builders in Texas.
Wow.
So the point being is, so they use the model of 1.2%, saying, well, the foreclosure default rate will be 1.2%. Well, 1.2% was historical based on people putting 20% down, having good credit, and having a good job history. Now we're dealing with people who don't have put any money down, have at best a spotty job history, and have poor credit. And lo and behold, the default rate went up to 11 or 12%, and our leaders were surprised. Who would have thought? I mean, you can't make this stuff up. It was absolute economic illiteracy of this. But why? They were trying to push home ownership, etc. They tried it when Bush's father was president as well. To his credit, the father actually said this is overkill. The realtors who are allegedly, by the way, I do have a real estate license, so when I make fun of them, I can, because I'm a realtor too. But the point being, they sat there and said that, you know, it's not fair. You're saying people have to have 50% of their closing costs, even if they're doing a no money down loan. At the time, nationally, you're looking at $2,500 to do the closing. Now let's be honest. If somebody didn't have $2,500 saved at that point, were they really ready to buy a house? Or were you just setting them up in a couple of years that they were going to lose a house?
Right.
You know, I really found that despicable. All they were doing was trying to set people up so people could get a commission.
Right.
Some politician could make believe that home ownership levels went up. You know, and all of this nonsense set aside for a lot of so-called investors to run all their scams, where quite frankly they belong in jail. Because I do know quite a few of them who are scamming people, and I'm thrilled when they go to jail, because that's where they belong. You know, you can do the business like any business. You can do it honestly, do okay, and not take advantage of people, make it work for everybody. But if you're going to be a crook, put them in jail. I'm happy to see them there. Okay.
We'll take one more question.
Sure. Yes.
What does any of this have to do with the idea that the Republicans want to cut give the rich the tax cuts?
What?
How does that, will that be affected by fair tax, or how does that affect
Okay,
us?
it doesn't affect the fair tax per se, because what happens is a totally different tax system. They're talking about the current code. Now, one misnomer always used by a lot of people is the words tax cut. There's no such thing. It's a reduction in tax rate. World of difference. The theory being, if I reduce the tax rate from, let's say, 35% to 30%, you bring in more money. Because now people, instead of looking for shelters, hiding the money, keeping it offshore, doing whatever, you say, tax rate is low enough, I'll just pay. Perfect example was back in '94 when they changed the capital gains tax. Remember, it was 50, what was it, 50% back then? And now they lowered it to 15, 20, and 25. By doing that, the Republicans had argued you're going to bring in a lot more money because you have a lot of people who were sitting on an asset for years. They had no more use for it, and they did want to sell it, but they weren't going to get 50% of it to Uncle Sam.
Right.
So they just sat on it. So once the rate got lowered down to 20%, at that rate they said, magic number, we'll sell it.
That does help.
Absolutely. They projected, Bill Clinton fought the tooth and nail, finally signed it. He projected, him and Tom, I'll never forget it, him and Tom Daschle projected it would bring in $5 billion over so many years. It actually brought in over $100 billion within 6 months.
Wow.
And it wasn't mostly the wealthy, it was mostly mom and pop selling an asset that they wanted to get rid of, but they weren't going to give it away to Uncle Sam.
But I mean,
Even
that does
So,
help the
yes,
poor in
the
the long
idea,
run.
oh, absolutely. The idea behind reducing the tax rate is if you want the rich or whoever you want to call to do something, is to lower the rate to give them an incentive to do it. Otherwise, all they're going to do is hoard whatever they have and not do anything. Whether it's the fair tax, a flat tax, or even the current tax code. So I do believe that if, under the current code, you're much better off having a lower tax rate, but not having all these special write-offs and exemptions. And people just pay the tax. Most people figure, if you talk to most so-called wealthy people, they say if the tax rate is 15%, they'll happily pay the tax and not deal with all the hassles. The government will bring in a lot more money. Incidentally, to prove this point, remember before I mentioned Bill Clinton, when he raised the tax rate and people were confused? The following year, did the rich pay more or less in taxes?
Less.
They paid less. They did exactly what anybody would do, common sense. They went to their accountant. The accountant told them at the time, make up to $200,000. You know how you used to make $250,000? You're not making that anymore. You're now going to make $200,000, and we're going to put the other money into some kind of whatever shelter. So they brought it less. Sure.
I got a comment. I heard this statistic. I heard the statistic this morning. The annual take-in from the IRS is $1 trillion in our taxes.
I'm sorry, the annual what?
The annual income of taxes is $1 trillion. Right. What the deductions amount to $1.1 trillion in deductions.
Yes.
And if you get rid of these deductions, all of a sudden you'll be taking in $2 trillion.
Right. Well, do any of you know how much your budget is every year for the IRS, to operate the IRS? Like $300 billion. Think about that. It's such a ripple, such a bad return on investment, it's mind-boggling. So go into a system which would be based on consumption, where you would have the freedom, the power goes to you, you're going to raise at least minimum the same amount of money. Quite frankly, you're going to raise a lot more when the reality sets in, because you're going to expand the economy. Think about all those jobs that will be coming back to the United States. Suddenly, North Carolina, it makes sense to make t-shirts down there again. It makes sense to start doing shoes. One thing in this country we've got to get over, this idea that we don't have to make things in this country.
Oh, no,
Until we had these ego thing about, we're in this post-industrial age, we've got technology and all this. Well, guess what? Doesn't cut it. You better start producing something that the rest of the world wants that you trade. Otherwise, all we're trading for them is junk metal.